Hello everybody, welcome to the third part of getting started in Red Giant for color grading. In this video, we will take a look into the process of building a look using Red Giant tools. There are plenty of tools in Red Giant that you can use to craft your look for your grading project. But one tool that really excels in doing so is Red Giant Looks. And in the previous video, you've briefly seen Red Giant Looks in actions. Rightfully so, because Red Giant Looks is the one-stop solution for creating show looks, adding texture to your grade, emulating film looks, and many more. All within a friendly Looks Designer interface. Red Giant Looks is available in multiple array of host softwares. You can use it inside DaVinci Resolve, Premiere Pro, After Effects, Media Composer, Final Cut Pro, Cinema 4D, and even Unreal Engine. So once you know how to use looks in one software, you'll be able to use it in many different software because the experience will remain exactly the same. In these examples, we are going to start in Premiere Pro, and then later on we'll move to DaVinci Resolve. In Looks, there are 4 main drawers on each corner for scopes, tools, controls, and presets. You can hover over it to open the drawer or use the shortcut to access these drawers. Press S to open the collection of scopes, T for tools, C for controls, and L for looks or presets. At the center of Designer interface is the viewer, where you can see the image that you use to build your look on. Below the viewer, you'll find an empty box with plus icon. This is the tool chain in Looks. You can click the plus icon and it will open the tools drawer. And from there, you can add the tools that you want to use to build your look. Like for example, when we click the optical diffusion, it will then be added to the tool chain. And as you click the selected tool, it will close the tool drawer and showing the Controls tab. You can adjust the parameter of your selected tool from this Control tab. Like before, you can press C to open and close the Control tab. And now, let's delete the tool that we've added to our tool chain. And we can do so by hitting delete on our keyboard or simply dragging the tool down from the tool chain. And now let's open Looks tab and select any presets. For example, this film grade from the film emulation category. As we can see, we have a look that was built from multiple set of tools. In the tool chain, you can then change the order of the tools and it will change the processing of the effects. For example, we can drag film negative and position it behind the film print, and you'll see different result as you do this. But since normally you would want the film negative before the film print, we can move it back to the front right after the halation. To reset the look that you've selected, you can simply press Reset, which is this circle arrow icon at the bottom left of the window. Next, we have access to 5 different scopes in Looks. We have access to some standard scopes like RGB Parade, Vector Scope, which is labeled as Hue versus Saturation, and some custom scopes like Slice Graph, which is a modified waveform scope, along with Memory Color and Hue versus Lightness. These scopes are adjustable. You can rearrange them to your liking, and when you are working in a bigger screen, then you can also readjust the size of these scopes by dragging the tab to be bigger or smaller. First, we have this RGB Parade to read the level of your video signal in its red, green, and blue color channel. And if you have override values that exceeds 1 that you want to monitor, you can simply drag the yellow cursor down to view more headroom in the Parade scope. And the next one is the Hue Saturation scope, which is a vector scope. You can use this scope to monitor the range of hue and saturation within an image. And this time, you can use the small yellow cursor to zoom in and out on the scope. The next one will be the Memory Color scope. It is showing the miniature copy of your image, but it will only display the flat color of red, green, blue, and flesh tones, which is this orangish tone. Since the color that we are normally working with in our image are very nuanced, it is sometimes hard to see the minute change that we are making. This scope is useful for monitoring the tiny changes we are making in our image. For example, pay attention to the skin tone we have in our image, which is represented with the orange tone in this Memory Color. When we do a slight hue rotations with Colorista, the Memory Color scope will show you if you've gone too far with your adjustment. If the skin tone is no longer orange in the scope, it is normally pushed too far in the image. And the next one is the Slice Graph Scope, which is the modified version of waveform. A waveform will normally give you the complete reading of your image, but Slice Graph is giving you the reading of one row of pixel, which is marked by the yellow arrow on the viewer. Imagine your image as something that consists of rows and columns of pixels. Pick any row, and that row will contain an average of red, green, and blue brightness value. And the final scope we have here is the hue versus lightness scope. It lays out the hues flat in the x-axis of the graph and the y-axis giving you the scale of the luminance or the brightness. So you can use the scope to measure hue against luminance, like when you want to see how close you are to blowing out this golden hour sky. Notice as I increase the exposure, all the hues in the image are getting brighter as well. The most important thing when using Looks before you do anything else is that you need to inform Looks what type of image you are having and what output space you are targeting. All of that can be done using the color management function inside Looks. Previously, we've seen that we can access that through the drop-down list available in the In-Out color space on the top left of the Looks Designer window. Here, you have quick access to some popular ins and outs. But the short list that we have here is not everything. And if your project requires you to set a specific input and output, but it's not listed in this drop-down menu, that's when you want to select Custom. And as you select Custom, you'll have access to the Color Management tab shown in the Controls tab. In this case, since we previously selected Acidicity in the drop-down list, it is automatically using Acidicity as an input and setting the output to be the same as the input through this checkbox. To change an input or output, you can simply select the drop-down and select the type of input or output that you desire. And as you can see, selecting Custom will activate the input and output icons in the toolchain. Now you can visually see that the look that you've built will be sandwiched between this input and output transforms. So now if we are going to select one of the presets, we'll see that the building block of our look is sandwiched between the two transforms. And the processing order begins from the input all the way to the output. And again, you can always change the order of your tools in the toolchain except for your input and output. Every tool has their own strength slider, and there is a global strength slider for your look right at the bottom of the window. Okay, now that we know our way around inside Looks, let's build our first look together. Let's start by browsing our available tools, and in this case we have 39 available tools, and they are grouped in 4 different categories. First, let's build our contrast. There are plenty of options to adjust contrast inside Looks. For example, you can use Colorista and tweak the contrast slider, or adjust the shadow and highlight wheels to increase the distance between them. Or, if you want to, you can also use the Print Film tool, where you can choose from 4 different print film emulation and tweak the contrast from there. But using Print Film, you will also have the change in the color. Or, if you want to, you can also just simply use the Contrast tool, where you can adjust the contrast and its pivot point. So let's increase the contrast in our image and adjust the pivot or leave it to 0.180 to leave our mid-gray untouched. In this case, I will leave my pivot point to be untouched. Next, let's play around with the hue in our image. And same like before, there are plenty of ways to do things in certain way, like when I want to emulate the look of film cross-processing. Then I can use the 2-strip process and move it in the front of my contrast adjustment. And from here, I can adjust the green sensitivity and tweak the strength slider. Or if I just want to tint my image with certain color, I can simply use the Color Blend tool. Maybe change it to something cyan and reduce the opacity of the effect through the strength slider. But I can also use the simple channel mixer to change the proportions of my RGB in my image. I can increase the blue in my red, and let's set it to 1. And let's increase the blue in my green halfway, so maybe around 0.5. And lastly, Let's adjust the green in my blue to somewhere between halfway and 1, so perhaps around 0.7. And now I can adjust my strength slider to mix the result of my adjustment just enough to show visible change on my image. Now that we have our preferred color proportion in our image, let's see if we need more saturation in our image. As always, there are plenty of ways to increase or reduce saturation, be it through the saturation sliders inside Colorista or the slider inside Hue Saturation tool. But I want to use a method that is more reliable and not just boosting the signal up using the saturation slider. And I can do such operation through Color Remap. Let's move our Color Remap tool behind the channel mixer. The Color Remap tool is actually a tool that allows you to pick one color and remap it to something else. And by default, we have these 3 neutral color patches mapped to themselves. So we won't change our blacks, grays, and whites. We can then create a new patch and pick a color and remap it to something else. On the top, there is a color model drop-down where we can pick a color model to do our adjustment in. There is this CIE Lab color model and its newer, more modern sibling, the JZ-AZ-BZ, which behaves exactly like the CIE Lab but more robust and more compatible with HDR and wide gamut applications. We know that these 2 color models are based on the opponent model of human vision, where red and green form an opponent pair and blue and yellow form the other opponent pair. So let's create 4 new patches for the maximum red or magenta, green, yellow, and blue. And at the moment, it looks funky because we are remapping those colors to gray and getting a monochromatic image as a result. So what we want to do is now to map these colors back to themselves, simply by clicking the arrow next to these color patches. So now the patches are visually showing you that magenta is mapped to magenta, green is mapped to green, and so on. Now if I turn the effect off and on, there should be no changes because we are mapping the colors back to themselves. Now, since I only want to increase saturations, what I can do is to go on the first color patches on the left and reduce the saturation. And by doing this, it means that I am targeting less saturated magenta, green, blue, and yellow and remap them to the same hue but with maximum saturation. And the sum total of this effect, if I turn it off and back on, is the increase of saturation that was done in the JZ-AZ-BZ space. Of course, I can always reduce the strength to add just a slight increase of saturation to my overall look. And now I can save this adjustment as my tool preset and give it a proper name. Perhaps something like saturation will fit. And I can also change the overall strength of this effect to tastefully introduce the amount of saturation increase for my look. Maybe something small around 30 to 35%. I can also use the previous method to change the color density in my image. So I'll drop another color remap and position it right after my saturation adjustment. And since I saved the previous adjustment as a preset, I can browse the preset and use it. Now, what I want to do here is to simply reset the modified saturation slider on the first wheel back to its initial state. And now I will change the luminance of each color patches using the grayscale slider on the right-hand color wheel. And by doing so, it means that I am not increasing any further saturation change with this second effect, but only modifying the density of each color patch. And the net overall result will be a change in color density, but the saturation will remain the same. Again, here I can play around with the strength slider and maybe set it to somewhere around 70 or 75%. And now we have the change of contrast, change of hue and saturations, as well as density for our look. What I want to do next is perhaps to add a simple split toning after my contrast adjustment. And I can do that with the help of this duotone tool. So now let's see how much tint in the shadow that we have. I can slide the balance slider to 0 and see the overall tint to my shadow. In this default setting, it is set to 25% with this cyan blue tint. Let's increase the shadow tint to around 30%. And now, let's set the balance slider to the opposite, to 100, and analyze our highlight tint. Here, let's increase the highlight tint to around 15%. And now, we can adjust the balance of our split tone if we want it to be pivoting more to the shadow or to the highlight. In this case, I want my balance to be slightly leaning onto the highlight side and set the balance slider to be around 70%. Now I can play around with the strength slider to define the overall strength of my split tone effect. I'll set it to somewhere around 50%. Now I'm pretty much done with my look. I can confirm it or I can further tweak it. With Red Giant looks, not only that you can change color and contrast, but you can also add textures and include it as the element of your look. So let's do that. First, the most common thing to add textures probably to add some film grain to our look. And I can do so by using Renoiser right at the end of my toolchain. Renoiser is adding virtual grain between the pixels in your image. So it's not a layer of grain set on top of your image. You can change the amount or adjust the proportions in the color channel, as well as across shadows, midtones, and highlights. What I like to do is to just simply start browsing the available presets. And in this case, I don't want an extreme grain, so I can perhaps go with something subtle like this image vitamin preset and just simply change it to monochrome grain. I can also add some diffusion to my image to add some more excitement. I can do so using the optical diffusion tool and place it right in the front of my toolchain. I want to emulate the process of acquiring the footage with a diffusion filter attached on the lens of the camera. The optical diffusion is respecting the amount of light coming in and will give out exactly the same amount of light on its way out. It is only modifying the available amount of light in the image and not adding or removing anything. It is known as the energy conserving principle, a method that is commonly used in rendering. In optical diffusion, there are tons of presets based on the physical diffusion filter available in the market. So if you are familiar with the Black Pro-Mist or Glimmerglass, you can mimic them in post using optical diffusion. Let's use the Glimmerglass presets since I really like the look of it. Also, if I want to, I can always stack this effect. So for example, I can add another optical diffusion and set it in front of the initial effect. And here, I can emulate an overall warmer scene by using this Warm Glow preset. And at the moment, it seems that this preset is only affecting the highlight of my image. As I turn it off and on, I can see that the majority of change is only on the highlight of my image. So if I want to, I can turn on the preview highlights and adjust the highlights only value accordingly. If I increase it, it will show me that I am only applying this effect on the very small white area on my image, which happen to be the highlights. And when I reduce it, I can see that I'm applying the effects to the entirety of my image. So perhaps let's set it to around 30%, and let's play around with the strength slider as well. So now I have my looks, which include a transform in my color and contrast, as well as adding some texture to my image. Let's save it as a preset, and let's give it a proper name. And then let's hit confirm. By the way, what I have missed showing you before is that within looks, you can absolutely use your collections of lookup tables. So let's go and let's start looks once more time. So now let's reset everything and let's drop in the LUT tool. You can bring in your collection of LUT by using this import button, and you can locate your LUT in your computer. I have some of mine that is already loaded, so I can select one of them. When using LUT, you really need to be aware of it. You need to know your LUT well. LUT can only work well if you are feeding it with the correct input and it will only giving you a specific output. But in looks, there is this input and output space at the top. You need to set up this field according to your LUT spec. In my case, I know that my LUT is working in ACISicity, so I need to set the input and output to ACISicity. So now, we can see that I am getting an accurate result from my LUT. So, there you go. Always be mindful of what input your LUT is asking and what output your LUT is giving you back. So now let's reset this and let's select the look that we've built together previously. Now bear in mind that the Premiere Pro version I am showing you today is not the full release version. But if you want to work with the current full release version of Premiere Pro, you can absolutely work with looks as well. So now let's switch to the full release version of Premiere Pro. And in my case, it will be Premiere Pro version 25.0.0. In the release version, since ACES CCT isn't fully supported yet, the default working space will be Rec 709. Thus, we will be seeing the desaturated and flat log images again. But that doesn't mean that we will transform these images by hand. Now what we want to do is we can use similar technique like before with looks. Instead of using one single adjustment layer for the whole clip, we will use more than one adjustment layers, depend on how many types of images we are using. So I will dedicate one adjustment layer for one type of camera source. Since we have two different camera sources in this project, namely Sony S-Log3 S-Gamut3.Cine and ARRI Log-C3, I will then create two adjustment layers and put them on top of my images accordingly. And let's go to the first adjustment layer for the Sony cameras and let's apply looks there. What you can do is go to Looks Color Management, select Custom, and deactivate Same as Input button to set the output to Rec 709. You will need to set the input to be your camera color space. In this case, it will be Sony S-Log3 S-Gamut3.Cine. In doing so, we will be using a color managed transform instead of color managed framework. That is because looks is actually working in ACES. Now, let's select the look that we've built together previously. And for the ARRI clip, I can repeat exactly the same process, but this time instead of setting the input to Sony S-Log3 S-Gamut3.Cine, I will need to set the input to ARRI Log-C and the output to Rec 709. Now, if I want to balance my images and tweak them individually, I can use Colorista in the clip level to do the correction under the look transform. In doing so, I'll be using Colorista in the camera original color space. And as I have promised you before, we will look into the different tools inside Red Giant Collection to spice up the looks that we've built together with Red Giant looks prior to this. And the easiest way to do that is by simply starting with Red Giant Universe. In Adobe software like Premiere Pro or After Effects, you can use the Universe dashboard to see the available Universe effects in Red Giant Collection. Universe is a collection of 100 of plugins that you can use to generate effects, create motion graphics, or add transitions. You can access Universe dashboard from the window menu, select Extension, and choose Red Giant Universe dashboard. Here, you can see that there are 9 different categories of Universe plugins. You can hover over the icon to see the preview of what each effect is doing. For example, if we want to add some kind of lens artifact to our look, like some light leaks or flares, we can go to the Stylize category and select Overlight. Overlight adds lens flare and light leak texture to the image. It gives you this washed out glow looks like when acquiring footage with a vintage, detuned lenses and aiming it directly to the light source. Overlight comes with presets and simple controls to adjust the overall effects. If this effect is a little bit too much, and especially if you only need just the lens flare, then you can use No Light Factory Easy. Designed by the VFX genius John Knoll, this plugin gives you a quick lens flare with really easy controls. Let's close the Universe dashboard for now. The way I like to use No Light Factory Easy is to first decide where to place my flare. Ideally, in the same place where the light source, the lens, is facing. And to do so, I'll click Light Location and it will give me this on-screen display icon where I can simply drag to my light source and place it to the location that I like. And from here, I can start changing the category of flares and select anything from the drop-down. You can also change the look of your flare by modifying the available controls. Or if you want to visually browse the presets, you can simply use Choose Flare button to open the preset window. No Light Factory Easy is a very easy way to generate a lens flare. But sometimes, when you need the extra details down to its nuts and bolts, especially when you want to simulate the real lens artifact, you definitely need the extra controls. And if you cannot find that within No Light Factory Easy, then it's a good indicator that you will need the real lens flare. Simply type in real lens flare in your effects panel and apply it to your clip or to the adjustment layer. At first, you'll see that there are plenty of controls that you can tweak from here in the effect panel. But behold, real lens flare comes with its own designer window, so you can focus building your lens flare and lens artifact precisely. And like before, let's adjust the position of our light source, and once done, let's hit Open Designer to launch the designer window. Here, we can clearly observe the lens flare that we initially have. We have the viewer in the middle, and below the viewer, you will see your virtual lens that you can use to simulate the lens flare. And by default, it is set to emulate this Sirui 35 anamorphic lens. If you want to simulate different lens, you can simply open the 4 rectangle menu on the top left, which is the preset window. And here, we can see under the lens simulation section, there are some available lenses that we can select as a starting point. So maybe let's check this Zeiss 50mm spherical prime lens. At the bottom on our virtual lens, you can click each element of the lens. Here, you can change the characteristic of each lens element. If you have lens collection or some white paper collections about some lenses, you can now emulate the characteristic of those lenses using real lens flare. You can also change the sensor size to mimic the sensor size of the camera used to acquire the image we are working with. And at the front, you have the light source, so you can also mimic the color temperature or filter used for the light source on the set. If you need all the detail and the flexibility, real lens flare will be your best friend. So let's close the preset window and let's analyze our lens flare. The flare we have here consists of a light ball, a starburst, a glow ball, and a reflection. If you want more, you can always use the plus icon to add some more characteristic like a ring or a halo. In this case, I just want to mimic the lens artifact without the flare. If I want to mimic dirt on my lenses that reflects back the light to the captured image, but without giving the lens flare, I can do so by adding schmutz and deactivate everything else. I can choose any texture that I like, from dirty water down to sand. I like the look of the specs. I can rotate it so it won't be mostly on the top of my frame. But since we place our light source on the top, the most visible specs will remain on top, close to the light source. Since I have a golden hour type of light in my image, and these specs are mostly blue, I probably want to change the type of my light source as well. And let's select the light source and change it to somewhere around 3000 degrees in a scale of Kelvin. And now let's hit confirm. So that's a brief overview of how you can use Red Giant tools for color grading inside Premiere Pro. Now let's head to Resolve. In Resolve, since it has a specific page optimized for color grading, things are a bit different. The thing that I love the most working with Resolve is the convenience of the workflow, which allow for a faster turnaround. And one of them is grouping. With grouping, we can group the same clips coming from the same camera as one group, and from there we will have an extra node level that serve as a group level. The group pre-clip and group post-clip. Any adjustment that we do in group post-clip will be applied to the whole clips in the same group after the node level adjustment, and any adjustment that we do in the group pre-clip will be applied to the whole clips that belongs into the same group but prior to the clip level adjustment. Moreover, since in Resolve you have access to powerful grading tools, the way you'll use Red Giant tools to build your looks will vary. You can of course build the entire looks within looks, same like previous example. But if you want to, you can also use looks just to achieve a very specific goal. So let me show you that. Here we have our clips grouped, and I will balance each of them in the clip level. For this night shot, perhaps I can brighten it up by adding some light using the global wheel in the HDR tool. The global wheel in the HDR tool will give you a more photometrically accurate result compared to the offset wheel when doing an exposure adjustment, especially when working in a color managed framework like we do here with ACES CCT. So I can increase the exposure a bit, and next, I'll move to the clip coming from ARRI and tweak the exposure there as well. If you have your own personal look that you've built within Resolve, in this case, I have prepped a Kodak 2383 print film look using the film look lookup table that was shipped with Resolve, except that I modified that to work in ACES CCT using the ACES Transform OFX. And I can then use Red Giant looks to tastefully add something more to my look. So, in Resolve, you don't have to use looks as the only element when creating a look. You can use it to solely emulate an effect, for example. In this instance, I use it to emulate a film negative as well as a diffusion filter. Previously, I've shown you briefly how you can emulate any diffusion filter using the optical diffusion tool in Looks, but we haven't looked into the detail. I have prepped a project for us to do just that. So now let's switch and let's take a look into the detail of the optical diffusion tool inside the Red Giant Looks. So here I have a scene that consists of two clips. The second clip was shot with Tiffen Black Pro Mist 1/4 filter attached to the lens. Now we are going to match that with optical diffusion tool in Looks. By the way, if you want to follow along, you can download the project file, which is also available as download. Before we begin, I'd like to point out that the optical diffusion tool as well as the halation tool in Looks were built using the same algorithm that respects the energy conservation principle. It means that the lights coming in will remain equals to the light coming out. So both of this tool will not add any extra stop of light to your image. It will only modify and transform the available amount of light. So your exposure will not move. So now let's prep our project and let's transform these two clips to our display space first. I'll use Color Space Transform on the timeline to transform both of them to Rec 709. Here, the input will be ARRI Loxi 3 and the output is Rec 709. I'll use luminance mapping for the tone mapping and set the gamut mapping to saturation compression. Here, I also have the forward OOTF checked. Now, we will do our work mostly before the transformations within the clip level. So we will be working in the camera space. Now let's apply looks from the OFX panel to this clip node and hit edit. Here, we want to set the in-out color space to ARRI Loxi. Once we are in, we'll add optical diffusion to our toolchain. And we can start by using the preset that it was shipped with. From the list, I can see that there is Black Pro Mist 1/4, and we can compare it with the Black Pro Mist shot. I have it loaded to my reference image library, and to bring that up, I can use the drop-down and select it. If you want to add the reference image to Looks, you can always use the small plus icon here. From my observation, I think we will need to tweak our optical diffusion a bit more. Here we have some parameters that we can tweak to match our diffusion. The most obvious difference here is that we have this dense yellowish halo around the light source, which we don't have in our clean footage. Let's tackle that as our first objective. Here, we can use the color wheel and set the color to this yellowish hue and adjust the saturation accordingly. Now we can see the halo more accurately. I will also change the quality to best. Now let's play around with the density slider to adjust the density of our effect. Perhaps let's park it around 10%. We can adjust the size to adjust the range of our diffusion effect. Here, let's increase it a little bit. Now we can play around with the fall-off to expand or decrease the spread of our diffusion. I feel like I'm getting a closer match when I'm reducing it a bit to somewhere around 33%. And now let's increase the glow a little bit to around 0.360. Now, I am seeing that the inner glow of my effect is having this desaturated effect, and the color is mostly on the outer halo. This is something that we can tackle using luster control. When we increase the luster number to positive value, we will introduce a chromatic separation to our glow. So let's back it off all the way to 0 to have this monochromatic tint. And as I am setting the luster to 0, I can see that I have an increase in the saturation on my glow. So I can tone down my saturations using the color wheel just slightly to match the reference image. So something like that would be nice. Now as we can see, the diffusion effect is applied to the entire image, while on the reference image, we can see that the diffusion was mostly present on the highlight, and it taper off as we go to the darker part of the image. So we can tackle this by using the highlight only control. So let's limit our effect to mostly happening on the highlight by increasing the number in this parameter. So something around 80% would be nice. Now as you can see, we can get a pretty matching result for our diffusion effect using the optical diffusion. Of course, if time is your friend, you can continue and spend some more time to perfectly match it, but for our purpose in this video, I think it's close enough. So now let's confirm it. Now, using Red Giant looks, you have an interesting texture that you can add to your looks that you've built natively within Resolve. So, don't feel that you have to build everything within looks. You can always use Red Giant looks to create one specific interesting treatment that you can add up to your overall look. And by now, you should be able to create something really interesting with your Red Giant tools. I hope to see you in the next video.